Emeritus professor at Brock University in psychology, where she had done a lot of teaching and research in areas such as forgiveness. She also has an MTS, I got that right, from Wycliffe College. And she's done a lot of work in what some people call knowledge translation, in terms of writing academic information, but at a non-specialist level. And she's recently, in her sort of semi-retirement, been doing a lot of traveling that makes me quite jealous, and where she's been pursuing some of her writing. Today she's going to talk about memory wars, and stay tuned because she has a book on this that's pending publication. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Let me start with one of my very favorite quotes about memory, which is memory is a complicated thing, a relative to truth, but not its twin. And it took psychology decades to come to a realization that a novelist had from the get-go. There are many points of agreement in the gospel accounts of the resurrection, but there's also many discrepancies. And I know those are quite upsetting to some Christians when they see those discrepancies. They were troubling to me when I became a Christian as a young adult. And yet, as we'll see, this is exactly what we would expect to see in such accounts. See, the issue is, if we kind of go back to this quote, is that it is a complicated thing, but there are important events where truth is critical. The resurrection is one. I stand with St. Paul that if Jesus was not raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. So that's a critical event. Another entirely different kind of critical event is criminal accusations. In both those cases, we're wanting to suss out truth, but sometimes all we have is memory. So today I'm going to be doing a flying tour through a number of topics, the resurrection and the memory wars, which I'll explain in a minute. But first of all, I want to let you know there's some things I'm not going to touch on, some issues I won't be addressing. One is the notion of oral tradition. So the gospel accounts were written long after the events based on oral traditions. And that raises the whole question of how much can we trust oral traditions? And that's an important issue, not critical for what we're talking about today. So I'm not going to touch on that. I am also going to take the Gospels in the canonical order. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the order that Christians reading the Bible are familiar with. So I'm not going to deal with what scholars think was the actual order in which these were written. I'm also going to treat the Gospels as originating from eyewitness accounts. Now, I actually will say a little bit about that later on. In why that might be a reasonable argument to make. But let's look at it the other way. If they are not, if we conclude from the nature of these accounts that they are not eyewitness accounts, then we don't have to worry about all those other issues, don't have to worry about oral tradition, don't have to worry about any of that stuff. So we're going to start from an assumption of looking at them as eyewitness accounts and see, are these credible as eyewitness accounts? So as I began, there's a lot of discrepancies in the resurrection accounts. We could spend this whole time just looking at them. I'm going to hit on some of the major ones, starting with who first discovers that the tomb is empty. So I'm looking to see, unfortunately, my little photo is, let me see if I can make that smaller for us so that it doesn't get in the way. Hide self-view. There we go. That helps. Let's move it as far as we can. There we go. So who first discovers the empty tomb? There we go. That helps. In Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. In Mark, it is Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and Salome. In Luke, it's the women, but then later in Luke, it specifies Mary Magdalene, different order from Mark, Mary Magdalene, Salome, mother of James, and the others. So we're seeing this expansion, right? More and more people. In John, it's Mary Magdalene, period. But when she runs to Peter and says the tomb is empty, she says, we don't know where they've put our Lord. So even within John, we're seeing a discrepancy here. Was it just Mary Magdalene, or was it Mary Magdalene and some others? Who subsequently went to the tomb? So after the women report that or find the tomb is empty, who finds that out later? Matthew and Mark, nobody. In Luke, it's Peter initially. So Peter runs, sees the tomb is empty, is perplexed. But later in Luke, we have the disciples who are on the walk to Emmaus talking to Jesus, not knowing it's Jesus. How crazy is that as a story? And telling Jesus some of ours who are with us. So again, a little bit of a discrepancy even right within Luke. In John, it is Peter, the other disciple, and Mary who come to the tomb the second time. Well, Mary, it's the second time. Peter and the other disciple find it's empty. Let's tie that up a bit. When the women got to the tomb, what did they see? In the case of Matthew, they found an angel sitting on the rock that had been rolled away. And it's described as his appearance was like lightning and his clothes were white as snow. In Mark, in the tomb, not on the rock, but in the tomb, they see a young man dressed in a white robe. In Luke, two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning suddenly appear beside them while they are in the tomb. And in John, at first, no one. The women don't see anyone. But when Mary goes back with Peter and with the other disciple, and again, nobody, but when they leave, then Mary sees in the tomb two angels in white. Now, she doesn't get very excited. So either this woman was in the habit of seeing angels all the time, or she didn't see angels. I'm guessing she saw men in white that she later concluded was angels. We'll come back to that. But she's weeping. She is not moved or excited about the appearance of these men. There are also, by the way, differences in what the angels say. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's some statement that Jesus is risen. In John, the angels merely ask Mary, "Why are you weeping?" When and to whom does Jesus first appear? In Matthew, it's to the women as they run back from the tomb to tell the disciples. So they see the tomb is empty, they're running back, and they see Jesus. In Mark, there's two accounts. Generally speaking, I'm not going to deal, something else I won't deal with is that within these traditions, we have different versions that don't always have all the various bits and pieces. So I'm mostly going to be dealing with what does your average Christian pick up the Bible and read? But sometimes I just need to note that there is these differences. So in Mark, in the first ending, the women run away and they don't tell anybody. But then we have a little short ending, and then we have a longer ending in which it's mentioned that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. See, in that third ending in Mark, it's kind of like, here's an overview of other stuff that happened. And it opens with that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. In Luke, it was to Peter, and it was to the disciples on that walk to Emmaus. We're not really sure from Luke which saw him first, but when the disciples return to say, "Oh, we saw Jesus on this road to Emmaus," the others go, "Yes, Peter's seen him too." And in John, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in that second tomb visit. We have discrepancies in location. So after the initial revelation, we have Jesus appearing in Jerusalem and then later in Galilee. In the case of Mark, it's kind of implied because the angel says, "Go to Galilee and you will see Jesus there." So we have reference to Jerusalem and Galilee. But in the Luke, let me move this creature again. Let's try. There we go. I don't think I'll ever need it to be there. Oops, back here. In Luke, and then also in the third ending in Mark, we have everything happening in Jerusalem and not in Galilee. We also have discrepancies in time span between the resurrection and the ascension. In Matthew, Mark, and John, we see multiple days. In Luke, and perhaps in the second ending in Mark, it all seems to happen on the same day. So there are other discrepancies in sequence, which was kind of implied, where what happened first, what happened second. But how do we understand all of these perspectives and all these differences from a psychological perspective? Well, up until the late 1980s, we had two big problems in our thinking about a couple of issues. One about memory. We thought that memory was like a videotape. We used that analogy. It was like a videotape. It might be hard to find. So if you think of a library tape, you might have troubles finding the tape. But once you remembered, memory was 100% accurate. It was like a videotape. And so that's how we saw memory then. Wrong, but that's how we saw it then. At that same time, we had another misconception, which was we thought that child abuse was extremely rare. A major psychiatry text at the time listed incest as less than 1 in a million families. My doctoral training in the late 70s, early 80s was arguably at the best school in Canada, and I was not assigned a single article on the topic of child abuse or child sexual abuse, not one. So it wasn't on the horizon. But in the late 1980s, as a result of the feminist movement primarily, we had adult survivors, mostly women, who felt emboldened by the support they were getting to start talking about the abuse that they had endured as children. Essentially, it was our first Me Too movement. But for many people, this was as unbelievable as the resurrection accounts. It's like, this is not possible that this many people have been abused. It was huge pushback, especially from psychology and from medicine. I had colleagues just telling me, oh, these people are lying. They're jumping on the Oprah Winfrey bandwagon. There was just this huge denial of these accounts that were coming forward. So we had on one side, we started to have this big divide. On one side, we had feminists saying, believe all women. And of course, it was in the context of a time when we thought memory was 100% trustworthy. So believe all women, they wouldn't lie about this, their memory is accurate, was implied, because that's how we saw memory. On the other hand, we went, this is insane. These women are lying, maybe because they're men haters, maybe because they are wanting their day in the sun. So that's where things were standing. And then came war. We had one remarkable family, had one heck of a blow up that essentially changed history. And in the early 90s, we had a war erupt. It was a war without guns and bombs, but a war just the same. People's lives were destroyed. People died by suicide. It was a horror show of a time. But out of that came this realization that child abuse is common. And out of that came a much better understanding of memory, its strengths, and its limitations. So let's take a sidestep and look at the memory wars. I have a very brief history. A couple of favorite lessons I learned in that period was that when you mix politics and science, you get politics. You might want to take science out and put religion in there too. You can have the same kind of bottom line there too. And no science is immune to the infection of politics and the corruption of power. So a brief history here. What were the memory wars? This was a vicious battle that emerged over what to make of this tsunami of reports of childhood abuse, especially those that were based on recovered memory. So when people said they hadn't remembered anything, sometimes for decades, and then as adults had memories of events that had happened in childhood. I was one of those people. So in 1991, I recovered a memory of being attacked by a group of boys in the playground. And when I was about 6, maybe 7, it's always hard to pinpoint those kinds of things. Fortunate for me, my sister confirmed with me later that a gang was operating in the neighborhood who was doing exactly that. And so I never had to second guess my memory in what became a very turbulent period. So the question about these memories and these reports of memories, are they memory? And I'd now say memory with the strengths and weaknesses of memory. So just because it was memory doesn't mean we're going to be sure of everything about that thing. But is it memory or is it fantasies, or what they at the time called and still continue to call false memories? Now, the concept of false memory was not new. We called it confabulation. And we still ought to kind of call it confabulation. If someone were to tell you an absolutely outrageous event, and you knew they weren't lying. So, for example, the time when I visited a elderly relative, she was in the hospital, she was hooked up to all kinds of tubes, and she was so excited when she saw me. She said, "Oh, Kathy, I had the best night last night. My friend Barb came, we left, we went shopping. You wouldn't believe it, Kathy. The stores were all open in the middle of the night, and I had a wonderful time. And then I came back." Of course she did. So if you heard that kind of tale, you knew the person wasn't lying. What would you think? Something's wrong with the brain. And you'd usually be right. And you still usually be right. That if someone is giving you a story of something absolutely remarkable, you know they're not lying, you know it can't have happened, then it's time to refer to a neurologist. But suddenly in this era, we had this claim, this sort of narrative emerge that, and the introduction of a syndrome, that these memories of abuse, these tsunami of memories of abuse, were false memories, were essentially confabulations, that they were an epidemic created by an army of fanatical feminist therapists. It started there, but in short order, it actually morphed to created by therapists, period. And the syndrome was invented, it was penned by a social psychologist, a research psychologist, who was not a clinical psychologist. So he never would have actually clinically interacted with any of the people he subsequently diagnosed in principle. This syndrome was never acknowledged by any diagnostic system. Eventually, the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association acknowledged the possibility of false memories, but the notion of a syndrome was never on the table and is still not on the table. And pretty much all of this happened because of one very toxic family whose problems spread a poison faster than COVID-19. So let me introduce you to the Fried family. In Christmas of 1990, Jennifer Fried recovered a memory of being sexually abused as a child and teenager by her father. Now, Jennifer Fried was a research psychologist specializing in the study of memory, ironically. So she was, in a sense, a well-positioned person. Within she told her parents, sent them home. They came for a visit to Christmas. They were packed up and sent home. Within weeks, her parents went on the offensive. They founded the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, making this argument that these are false memories. Sorry about that. I should have closed my mail before I launched into this, but we got so many layers up here. We are not going back to the mail to shut it down. So we'll have the occasional dong. Just put up with it there. We'll get through. So her parents went on this attack. Her mother, Pamela, went full frontal attack on her daughter. So 2 months after, you have a daughter who's shattered here, right? Even if you think she's completely wrong, is this what you would do to her? So this was a year in which Jennifer Fried was coming up for promotion to full professor. So for those of you who aren't academics, promotions are voted on by your colleagues in the department in the first instance. So mom starts calling these colleagues, telling them about this accusation. Jennifer Fried had no intention of going public, ever. She told her parents, that was it. Telling the colleagues that her daughter has sexual problems in her marriage, mom made this up, and that's why this horrible stuff was happening and how much the parents were suffering. Shortly thereafter, mom wrote I should mention, by the way, both her parents had PhDs themselves, very talented people. Mom turned out to be an absolute genius for working what we call now social media, working the media. She wrote a supposedly anonymous story of Jane Doe. It actually had fictional elements in it, which she admitted. It's a little ironic. Someone who was wanting to say that her daughter has lied is now promoting a story that has lies in it. And she published it and then started sending copies of this to everybody, all in sundry, the public media, Jennifer's colleagues again, and now on False Memory Syndrome Foundation letterhead. So 6 months after Jennifer Fried recalled her memory, this foundation is founded, it's up and running, and it's being used as a weapon against her. By February 1992, it was incorporated and fast becoming an international media star. Ultimately, Jennifer's sister, the only sibling, her uncle, her father's brother, grandmother, father's mother sided with her. But the world mostly stood with the Frieds, the parents. And for the longest time, she was silent, and we're all going, does she agree with them? And then ultimately, in August 1993, she broke a 2-year silence and had a brilliant paper in which she introduced a theory based on her memory expertise on how such memories could be forgotten and then later recalled. And then also, again, a very tactful tale. She said, I'm not telling you the details of my memories. Let me tell you about my family. And that's where some of these details I just gave you. And to quote her, she says, at times I am flabbergasted that my memory is considered false and my father's memory is considered rational and sane. He was hospitalized for alcoholism, by the way. So this is not just hearsay. I wonder why people believe they can decide the truth of our family, and more, why they then decide that my father's memory is more reliable than my memory. Is it because I remember impossible or crazy things? No, I remember incest in my father's house. So what was the impact of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation? Well, first of all, they promoted very effectively this narrative about where these memories were coming from. And what is troubling to me today is that misconceptions have persisted. So all kinds of people never even heard of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. But I'm finding there are a couple of persisting beliefs. One is that you can't fully trust sexual abuse reports, that they're less reliable than reports of other criminal behavior. That's a pretty common belief I'm finding. That's a hangover from this period. Secondly, is that false memory is easy to create. False memories can be created. We'll talk about that in a minute. Not easily. And not about dramatic things like you have never experienced in your actual life. But there is this persistent narrative is stuck in our guts that has hung over from that period. The other thing is the mainstream media just glommed onto this. I mean, I was stunned at how fast. There was this short period of reporting about, abuse. Oh my goodness, abuse is great. By the way, false memory. And there was just this huge swing over in the media to focusing on false memory. Professionals embraced it with bewildering enthusiasm, because you have to understand, initially, there was absolutely no evidence. We had lots of memory research looking at errors in memory, and it's shown clearly that we tend to get the main stuff right, and the details we get mistaken at. There was no evidence that one could form a memory for a big event like this. And yet my own department, people were abuzz. They were so excited about it. And I'm going, what is going on here? There was intense lobbying to restrict psychotherapy. And for a while, there was legislation introduced in a number of the US states that would have seriously limited the ability for anybody to provide psychotherapy. There was also big initiatives, and there's a current one rising in Europe, to not allow recovered memory as testimony in a court. Now, I would always agree that any one memory is not, and there should never be enough to convict a person. And it's never that simple, presumably almost never that simple anyway, but to not allow a witness to testify because the memory is recovered would be pretty much eliminating the option of justice. Huge suppression of research dialogue. Best study of my life. I'll tell you a little bit about it later. Never could get that thing published. It was one major journal sent it back to me. The editor said, I'm not even sending it out for review. The topic's too hot. We're not going to touch it. Well, then how does science proceed if we can't have review and publication of findings? I had other journals where I'd get lots of positive reviews, and then one crazy, I remember one case that was longer than the article itself, this incredibly biased review. I was too young. Now I would push back, but I didn't, and so couldn't get that thing published. But what would happen is, because many of us weren't getting our research published, we exchanged it. We gave it to each other. And we presented it in conferences, and it got put into the hands of lawyers. So I later on found out that study actually of mine was actually cited in many a court case, now sits in several legal textbooks. I don't think that's how it should have been. It should have gone to peer review. And then if it stood that appropriate peer review test been used in court, but that without my wanting that is what happened. And that was the only way for it to happen. threats against therapists and researchers on both sides, by the way. So now the hostilities are going in all directions here. And this was at a time when we weren't used to death threats on the media. We weren't used to people picketing your home or picketing your office. So this was like a brand new thing. It was horrifying. It was terrifying. We also had therapists being, well, just back up, because a couple of things I experienced was my students being pulled aside. They were undergraduate students. We didn't have a graduate program at that time. Undergraduate students being pulled aside by my PhD colleagues in the hallway and being grilled about their research, which is just over the top. I had a large guy standing in the doorway of my office one day, blocking any exit I would have, screaming at me. So again, I just never saw that in my life coming in my research, and certainly nothing in my training prepared me for that. Then the False Memory Syndrome Foundation started really encouraging parents to sue therapists, the therapists of their daughters. And that was, while almost all those cases were dismissed and none had sort of a really resounding, satisfying solution for the parent, so most of those were dismissed entirely, it was a very effective technique because it meant that the therapist's records would be subpoenaed and the therapist would be forced to testify. This is why most survivors do not take their parents to court. Because if you ever had a journal when you were a teenager, did you want your parents reading that? So similarly, this was and of course, it put a real wrench in the relationship between therapist and survivor. So basically, survivors were hugely re-traumatized. They had their brief moment of coming out and being more open. Now they were in full flight. I had one student who went on to social work school tell me that they were taught to never even ask whether somebody had a history of sexual abuse for fear of creating a memory from a single question. The world had gone mad, was my sense at the time. So let's turn quickly to the research. I can only give it to you because we only have so much time in broad strokes. So on the recovered memory side, there is a consistent finding. The findings vary a little bit by sample, but that a little under half of people, adults, who are reporting that they've had a history of abuse, also report that they've had periods of amnesia for part or all of that memory. A different approach was taken by Williams in reported in 1994. She identified hospital records of people who as children were hospitalized and treated for sexual abuse. And now she followed them up 17 years later to ask them as young adults what they remembered of that. And 38% remembered nothing. People with recovered memory are as likely to have corroboration as those people who have always remembered. I've only seen one study, a recent study that had where it was slightly the case that those with recovered memory were less likely, but there are many studies where they are as likely. So the overall finding is that these memories are as reliable as those that we continuously remember. So my study that I was so proud of, but never saw the light of publication day, what was special about it is the data was collected before the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was even on our horizon. I was actually going after this thing of, oh, they're lying. So what I did is I studied took people who were reporting that they'd been abused as children, people who said they'd not experienced any trauma or abuse as children. And I asked half of those who had never experienced trauma to fake sexual abuse and fill out our measures as if they'd been sexually abused. And we had all kinds of sort of obscure measures. So we had learned, for example, that the content of your nightmares are tremendously revealing, even though it's not obvious. Sexual abuse survivors don't tend to dream about sex, but we could pick up from their nightmares and differentiate them even from people who've been physically abused. So we had these kind of subtle measures. And then I threw in at the last minute, just because I was curious, have you always remembered the abuse? So now I have people who've always remembered, people who recovered a memory, people who had not been traumatized, people who were lying for us. And then the memory wars broke. It was like the perfect data for the day. So you can see why nobody wanted to publish it from the other side. And what did we find? First of all, we found that people faking abuse are really, really good. They can do a really good job of faking abuse. But just the same, it was differentiable from those who had that. And the people who always remembered and those who were had recovered memory were almost indistinguishable, except for one measure, which was a measure of your ability to kind of what we call dissociate, take memories and pack them off. And people with recovered memories were better at that. Very sensible, makes sense. On the, I'm going to lump together the can't trust report side, we learned all kinds of things too. First of all, people do lie. Not a lot, but people do lie. That blew me away. I just never thought somebody would lie about something like sexual abuse, because when you say you've been sexually abused, you inherit a world of grief. So that was something that I was a little slow to come to. Many of us were slow to come to, but came to realize people can lie. But it is no more frequently, it doesn't happen any more frequently than for any other accusation. There can be errors in recall. Memory is not videos. It has errors, and I want to come back to those in a minute as we eventually wend our way back to the resurrection. Eventually, the problem is, how do you study false memory? And eventually, some really clever techniques came that really are very clever and have helped us to better understand the conditions under which we can form false memories. So false memories of not, I mean, we can't study trauma. We can't induce trauma ethically, right? But we can look at extraordinary things. And false memories of non-traumatic events can be induced in some people, in a minority, but it's a substantial minority. I'm not talking 1 or 2%, depending on study, quarter, third, potentially. Probably more likely, given the latest analysis, about 11%. That's still a lot of people. The typical study, the best study, the most effective study, works this way. You give us permission to contact your parents. We then go to your parents and say, give us a list of big events that happened in the when this person was 5 or 6 years old, in their sort of earliest childhood. We get that list, we then add a false event. And my very favorite was studies where the false event they added was that when you were 5 years old, you went to a wedding and you knocked the punch bowl over onto the parents of the bride. So we add that to the list. You now come into the lab and we say, look, we're looking at how well people can remember childhood events. And we have this list from your parents. So let's go through each one. You tell me what you can remember. Do you remember the time when? Do you remember the time when? Do you remember the time when you're at that wedding and you knocked the punch bowl over onto the parents' brides? Now, the first time through, people go, whoa, no, I don't remember that. Now, some people, though, will say, I don't remember that, but you know, I'm really clumsy. Or I don't remember that, but I was at a wedding when I was 5. Geez, I don't remember about the punch bowl, though. So some people connect with this memory. Now we bring you back usually a week later for a second, and then a week later again for a third, go through all the list. And by that third interview, we have a portion of people starting to say they think they remember this. A third is the most common number. The punch bowl studies, there were several of them, was about a quarter, because the punch bowl is pretty dramatic. But about a quarter are saying, yeah, I can begin to sort of remember this. I think, yeah, I believe this happened. What we have, so what we also found just quickly is that usually the memory you report is closer to reality. So I don't think anybody ever remembered throwing the punch bowl onto the bride. Some people remember knocking over a punch bowl, but not onto the bride's parents. Some remember knocking over a glass onto a person. So it was like the memory they got was a little bit more believable, a little bit more ordinary, a little bit closer to real experience. And it was those people who identified with it in the first instance who were more likely to form a false memory, which suggests that false memory is probably best thought of as being really flawed memory, that it's built up from actual experiences you have had. Again, making it less likely that you're going to form a false memory of something totally unlike anything that you have experienced. The other and really most important thing that's just emerged in very recent research, finally they started asking people about those memories, and you find that often folks will say, actually, I know it's not a memory, which is interesting. But also what we found is that it's much easier to form a false belief. And hey, false beliefs can be damaging. If you believe your parent abused you, and there's good case stories of people, one really nice book, My Lie, And she, for years, wouldn't let her children visit with her father because she believed, but she never had a memory. Had the Freids formed a false belief syndrome, a foundation, we would have fought about the syndrome bit. We would have fought how frequent it was. We wouldn't have had a war. It was this preposterous suggestion that there was this pandemic of false memories. So that's an interesting little thing. So quickly, the conditions that facilitate false memory, because that's going to be important when we consider the resurrection events, extreme social influence. So yeah, there were some case histories that emerged of people who were just, it was like being in a cult. They were in daily groups where it's like, you must remember, you obviously have been sexually abused. You're showing everything we expect. And daily groups and therapists who are layering that, and they're immersed in a community where even friends were saying, come on, I just know you were sexually abused. And that this book, My Lie, that was what she experienced. And but again, she formed a false belief rather than a very damaging false belief. So extreme social influence can, such as we can't even really create in a lab. There's good evidence that under that, I mean, brainwashing, right? We're sort of aware of that phenomenon can create at least a false belief and perhaps false memory at times. Family members are a potent source of influence. So in those lab studies, when you invoke family, your family say this happened, that's when you get the strongest finding. So we sometimes need to remember that families can have a real impact on how people think, including saying you had a happy childhood when you didn't. So it's like we've been focusing on false memories of problematic childhoods, but I can tell you about all kinds of folks I know who've had false memories of positive childhoods. And family has just had this story that people have been really immersed in. False memories are often similar to actual experience. Some of the most compelling, actually the only really compelling cases I had read, could be others that I haven't, of a true false memory of sexual abuse was in people with a known documented history of sexual abuse. So they were known to have been abused here, and then they developed a false memory about somebody else. So they've got the memory stuff to build with, and they got a very important contextual cue wrong. So characteristics of memory and of eyewitness. So what did we learned a lot in all of this about memory? So first of all, we do tend to get the big stuff right, but we can't trust our memory of details. So when we look at these gospel accounts, they all seem to agree that the women found an empty tomb. They all seem to agree that there was, but was it one woman? Was it two women, multiple women? That detail is mushy. But women found the tomb empty. They also, there's this agreement that there was this mysterious man or men in white. And again, agreement there, but is it one man? Is it multiple men? Details. Can't trust those details. We also know that over time, memories, those sort of memories of stories, do incorporate new wisdom, which is a good thing. As you learn things, you get new insights on events that happen, but that can then morph the story. I think that's what we're seeing with this man-angel bit. So especially I look at Mary Magdalene not reacting to the two angels in the tomb, though she describes them as angels. So I'm guessing what happened is people saw men, as it's described in a couple of the Gospels, but then after the fact, they've seen Jesus and they're reflecting back in the Gospels, had to have been an angel. And you'll notice all the accounts commented on the white clothes, by the way, right? These were women, I suspect they did the laundry. They were all four accounts like, wow, you look at how white those clothes are, must have been an angel. So now we have a morphing from man to angel. And then society takes on that memory, and we have some Old Testament precedent for there being wings in this package. And over time, those angels have wings, they have halos. And you've all seen beautiful stained glass in the tomb. There's the women, there's an angel with wings and with halo. Well, there was no wings or halo. There was guys in white. Most common error is forgetting. That's the most common error, is forgetting. And we can forget big things. We can forget life-changing things. One of the things I've just noticed that the literature has kind of overlooked, we can forget positive things. So my spouse and I had a trip to the Yukon in the middle of the pandemic. We hadn't been in over 10 years. We used to go a number of times to the Yukon. We had life-changing things happen in those first trips to the Yukon. that were unforgettable until we forgot them. And as we were traveling back, we go, Kate, do you remember when one or the other would say, and often the other go, no. Yeah, remember this happened and that happened. Go, oh yeah, we started to recover memory. So it's not just traumatic big events. Big positive events can be forgotten. So forgetting is very common. As a result, and we see in the gospel accounts, we see some details missing. Now, maybe that was a choice, right? Because we know that each gospel was written for a particular audience, a particular context, a particular need. But sometimes it was because the oral tradition that was attached that they were drawing on. It had been forgotten, some of these details. Bottom line is, if one person says something happened and one person says it didn't, listen carefully to the person who says it did. I'm not saying accept it uncritically, but you want to give attention to the one, and privilege, if you will, to the one that says it did happen. Timing, sequence, certainty are often in there. So what came first? When exactly did something happen? We can't trust our memories of these things. We sure can't trust memory of certainty. So you can feel really confident about something you remember and be wrong. And you can be really not sure about something and be right. So one error that jurors tend to make in trials is that if a witness recalls details, there was a spider walking up the wall and the room was painted pink and I heard music paying off in the distance, and they say it was certainty, jurors tend to be really swayed by that. No, can't trust memory for details, can't trust certainty about memory. So now you know, don't be thrown by those things. But memories for the big stuff, the core events, even if it's fuzzy memory, is usually something that you can work with. We don't have to time this, so I'm going to hop. But often what comes up is people say to me, "Yeah, but I remember this way, and my sibling remembers it that way, and it's like we're raised by different families. We don't have time, but if in the questions you want me to go over that, I'll go over things like this." But now let's just come back to start to wrap up with evaluating these resurrection accounts or any other unbelievable event. So we hear an unbelievable tale, or what to our ears an unbelievable tale. What should we be thinking? Well, maybe they are lying. People can lie really, really well. I used to, one of my main duties in the last 10 years I was at Brock was I did plagiarism interviews. Oh my goodness, people can lie really, really well. And I thought I was pretty good at catching it, but at one point the ombudsperson who was representing and coming with all these students in the summer after, when it was all said and done, she looked at me and said, "You do understand they were all lying to you, Kathy." And it was a lot worse. They were all lying to you. Could have fooled me. So maybe they are lying. And that's something that needs to be considered. Let's think about the resurrection tales. I mean, let's face it, these disciples had given up family, jobs to follow Jesus, and now they're out. Maybe it came into their mind that, hey, we can make lemonade out of these lemons. But if that's so, wouldn't you suppress crazy stories? Certainly not lie about things like the Emmaus walk. Or Mary mistaking Jesus for a gardener. Like, would you put that into a lie? Like, this is not credible. I would not be having that kind of story if I was lying. We also see an amazing commitment to truth in these accounts. So, for example, in Matthew, we have this section where the disciples have gone to Galilee. They see Jesus. Now, it's disciples, not just those inner ring apostles, disciples. They see Jesus. And Matthew 28:17 says, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Whoa, that's honest. I wouldn't put that in a lie if I was concocting a story from scratch. Also impressive that the church retained those discrepancies in the canon. There was at times people would come up with these sort of smoothed over stories. They never got traction. They never lasted. The church has retained these different accounts with their discrepancies. And that speaks to an integrity in the church. And we're seeing, obviously, by definition, with all these discrepancies, discrepancies, a lack of a sort of uniform, rigid story. When we look at problematic cults, we see that invariably there is a rigid single story. You're signing on for it. We tolerate no disagreements. And some churches, tragically, some Christian churches function like problematic cults. I've met all kinds of people who left Christianity because they weren't allowed to ask questions. They weren't allowed to express doubts. Their little home church was functioning like a dysfunctional cult. You are going to believe it this way, and don't talk to me about discrepancies in the resurrection accounts. This is what happened. So that's what cults do. If the early church was that kind of cult, we would not be seeing these gospel accounts in the form that we're seeing. We'd see a uniform, rigid tale. And then there was this small matter that these disciples, by going out and proclaiming all this, were running a real risk of crucifixion. It's not anything anyone wants to face. And in fact, they were arrested, they were beaten, they were terrorized, and they were executed. So this was a very costly lie. So to my mind, as a psychologist looking at this, the lie possibility just doesn't hold water for me. Well, maybe it's fiction or a myth. Well, I'm going to turn to C.S. Lewis on this. He was a professor of literature, big word, lots of syllables, professor, and has expertise that I don't have. One of the things he said is that actually in that era, there was no such thing as a novel or fiction. It wasn't a literary form that existed. They had myth and they had reports. And so I'm not going to second guess him on that, and though I will add something in a minute. But he also makes the argument that is a myth, it just doesn't look like a myth. It doesn't sound like a myth. And certainly if you've read any myths, I'm older, so we had some training about that even in high school. I have to agree, it just doesn't fit. And I also want to point out to you that if it is fiction and it's presented as nonfiction, then it's a lie. So everything we just talked about of lies would apply. So it looks highly unlikely to be fiction. And I've never heard of any scholar, maybe it's out there, I've never heard of any scholar challenging Lewis on that statement that this does not fit the form of a myth. Well, maybe it's false memory. Well, one of the things there is the strongest evidence for false memory is for single events, not for multiple events. And here we have a collection of events. That's going to be a whole lot harder to pull off a memory for. It's one thing to remember once knocking over a punch bowl, but to try and be persuaded that every time you went to a wedding or any party, you were knocking over punch bowls. It's going to be much harder to establish. And here we do have a collection of events. Also, what we've studied and can, with some effort, produce is memory in a single person. But to have multiple witnesses, to have everybody who was at that wedding go, yeah, Janet knocked over the punch bowl, is a whole different order of, and again, not something that we have evidence that one could pull off easily. In general, when we see, to remind you, when we see outright false memories, you're going to want to look for two things. You're going to want to look for either brain injury or disease. This may be time for a referral to a neurologist. Or you're going to be wanting to see extreme influence that shaped that memory. And again, that doesn't fit well to my reading with what we're seeing in the early church. Might have happened, obviously, in pockets thereafter, but so then what are we left with is this eyewitness testimony. And if it is eyewitness testimony, we certainly are seeing the kinds of errors we'd expect. We are seeing agreement on the main events, but we're seeing all kinds of confusion in the details. We're seeing confusion in the sequence of events and in timing. If it's eyewitness testimony, how do we evaluate it? Because first of all, even if it is consistent with eyewitness testimony, which I would argue it is, does that mean it's eyewitness testimony? No, obviously. If those four gospel accounts were identical, I'd be saying this is not eyewitness testimony, and we'd sort of be done evaluating these things. So all I'm saying is it's the kind of presentation we'd expect to see with eyewitness testimony. But then theologians, you have other work that needs to be done because we have oral tradition. We have different provenances around some of the portions of these gospels. But it's certainly at face value is consistent with eyewitness testimony. And when we have eyewitness testimony, How do we evaluate it? How do we suss out truth when all we have is memory? Well, in the first instance, we look for other people. We want to get other reports. Interestingly, Christians also get in a fuss about, oh, there's so many versions and there's so many different translations and there's all these different manuscripts and they're kind of wanting like one. And if they realize that we have one, we are dead in the water, because how do we evaluate it? So my very, very favorite resurrection tale is Jesus cooking fish for the disciples by the Sea of Galilee. We have one account of that. So how can we sort it out? When we have multiple accounts, we can start to look for consistencies. We can look for patterns that can help us sort out what probably is at the core of this. So when we look for those consistencies across these 4 accounts, we see the tomb was empty. Everybody agrees. At least one man in white said Jesus was risen. Women were the first witnesses. And Jesus was seen alive on multiple occasions, sometimes in close quarters. Isn't that what matters? Not those other details. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. We have time for questions. You all remembered this presentation well?
Oh, yes. Sorry. We need to repeat the question. So the question was, weren't the Gospels written at different times? And some earlier and some later. So exactly how later, they keep actually moving it in, by the way, which is kind of good news. But yes, they were. And that's why this whole issue, they were based on oral traditions that were spread. And then, so that's why, yeah, there's a whole areas of theology that want to deal with how much can we trust oral traditions, what was the context in which this was written, that help us, that might have shaped how that actual account was written. So yes, all of that is actually the case too. And therefrom, I mean, one of the things I just have to sort of pitch in as a Christian is that we need to also remember that this is a book co-written and co-authored with God. And so from a Christian perspective, I'm assuming some oversight in this process, but obviously not everyone does. And that is exactly some of the issues that theologians struggle with. And I have a theologian standing right beside me. Maybe you want to add something to that, Jen?
No, that's...
So the comment was that the theologians have had the wisdom to already observe that if all the Gospels were the same, I trust you all know I'm repeating this for the recording, that then we know they're not true. And that then there is this reality that oddly enough, we didn't seem to grasp until the 90s, by the way, in this society and in psychology, that eyewitnesses do disagree. And hence you go looking for the consistencies. And that's why the more eyewitness and the more we know about those eyewitnesses, the better we can start to hone in on what is real. I like to think of it as being like if you had a poor flashlight and we threw it on, and this is the sort of eyewitness report, and we get like a vague bit of light here. But then we have a second one, a different flashlight, and it overlaps. The area of overlap gets brighter. And then we have another, and we have another, and we start to get this core. Doesn't mean that this stuff is all wrong, but we can be more and more confident about the places where there's agreement. So the question is, so the more, when we have the more witnesses that are agreeing, can we be more confident about the truth? That's exactly the strategy when you see police saying, please come forward if you've had any experience with fill in the blank. That's what they're going for. It's always complicated, right? And the more important the issue is, the more care that needs to be taken. But absolutely, the more witnesses that we have, their points of overlap and agreement are something we can be more and more confident about. So the question is, can we sort of right away know when someone's creating something in their mind? I mean, it helps if you see them attached to a hospital bed with lots of so but the bottom line is no lying too. Sometimes we forget about lying can be incredibly believable. And similarly, false beliefs can be very potent. And we're living in an era where somebody's beliefs have to be false when we have such competing beliefs, right? And yet if you just went by the statements, how would you sort out? So you've got to look to other evidence to try and sort it out.
And one of my questions is along those lines. So, but do you distinguish between intentional lying and unintentional lying? And by that, I'm thinking, like we talked about neurological disease and confabulation. But you've also got the normal developmental stage of children where they don't distinguish between reality and imagination, etc. So they're not really lying; they're telling stories.
That's the problem, isn't it? When you kind of lay out these options, it's like lying and sort of lumped. Because similarly, adults who lie really can get to believe their own lies. They say it enough.
Right.
By the way, the good news about children is they are much better reporters than we thought. So the research is, because we used to think, oh, if they're young, forget it, can't trust what they have to say. Again, with appropriate, non-directive, because children live in their bodies. They don't bring these evaluative theories to their experience. So if you just get them, without leading them, get them to describe what they saw, what they heard. Even really very young witnesses can be effective, useful witnesses. Yeah, and the comment that was just made was that we're becoming increasingly aware that following traumatic events, people can behave in quite unexpected ways. So, they've just been attacked by somebody and they send a chatty, friendly email the next day, and that can then be used against them. But in fact, there's sensible ways of understanding that when you don't bring preconceptions. So we are beginning to, in a sense, the second Me Too movement, the first Me Too movement in that 90s, was just discovering that abuse and domestic violence generally was real. But we somehow didn't cotton on that meant there's a lot of offenders out there. And so now we're in the era of people accept, oh yes, lots of children being abused, but nobody seems to be doing the abuse. And we now have come into an era where we're waking up that, gee, people we love and respect do this. And having to better understand that. And then also your catchphrase is trauma-informed. So we need trauma-informed policing, trauma-informed judges, trauma-informed medicine, trauma-informed therapy, where there is this better understanding of how trauma can kind of mess with how you react and remember and report and act after an event.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that Freud heard a lot of horrific stories of incest, and they were so horrific he thought people must be lying, but then he eventually realized they were telling the truth.
Actually, it was the reverse.
The other way around?
The other way around.
Okay.
Yes, and the memory for sequence, thank you. She just demonstrated it for us.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's true. And just so I'll join you in that.
For the record, I was not confident.
There you go. I was confident about one. When I was doing research for my memoir, by the way, should you want information about it, you can just leave me your email address and I will send you that. I was certain about 2 talks that I had heard that I thought were 1 year apart. They happened on the same day. And I was able to find that from the record because I keep endless papers, as my poor spouse will testify. I found the original was able to show those things. So Freud did, in his early theory, think that neurosis in the women he was seeing was caused by incest, and then came under remarkable pressure to recant, and probably himself began to think this just isn't possible, and then went to this very elaborate theory about women having fantasies about sex with their parents. And so you have this oddity where you now have, again, a significant number of psychiatrists who find it easier to believe that a child would have fantasy of sex with a parent than that a woman would accurately recall that parent hadn't sexually abused them. So and there's that, again, lasting influence from Freud that is unfortunate. And so the question is there something we professionals can do to sort out whether something is real or whether it was false? And you actually asked that in your first question too, and I didn't get to that. They're doing a lot of research right now on just that. Can we sort out false memories? So especially with that lovely paradigm, we can look at the memory you produce. For those who do create false memories, we can compare your memory to that, to your memory to other things. Tends to have less details, tends to have less, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's as equally detailed. So it's proving elusive at the moment. I believe they're starting to do physiological studies of the brain to see if they can find differences in how the brain fires up. But I'm going to bet that's going to prove elusive because when you imagine something, it fires up the same areas of the brain as if you imagine yourself on a roller coaster, for example, fires up the same areas as if you were on. So it's tough. I wish there was a simple answer to these complex
I
things.
would just add, in clinical experience, you have the advantage of seeing people repeatedly. So you can get to know them, and you can, if you find there's other discrepancies and they seem to be exaggerating, seem to be making, you can have some sort of doubt.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with time, but you can never be 100%. And the other question is, do you need to know if what they're saying is true, right? Because if you're helping them therapeutically, what they believe is what's important. It's only if you're coming to legal stuff that you do need to know. Yeah.
It's interesting because the brain, in these so-called errors where it doesn't retain details very well, it doesn't keep timing and sequence, we don't usually need to know that stuff. That's why, at the end I said, really, what's important? Tomb was empty, guys in white, Jesus, there he is. That's what's important, not these details. But in a court of law, the details can be very important. But we have a brain that, when you think of how much we're taking in, even in this room, from the scent of this room to the sound to our brains do not even want to try and retain all of that. So the brains keep the takeaways, the important lessons, shed the details. So then we can't be blaming someone for, like Christine Blasey Ford being blamed because she can't remember exactly when she went to that party or where that party was. Details, doesn't matter. She was raped. Well, she wasn't actually, she was actually assaulted. Those other things are irrelevant details, but somehow we hold it against her that she can't recall that. We just don't understand memory.
It actually ties in with my talk from last month, where I was talking about how we only pay attention to things, and also we like meaning. So if something is going to be meaningful and make a nice story, that's what we will latch on to. We're less concerned with accuracy, meanings.
I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, the other flip side of therapy is that I remember at one point, what a turning point for me that helped me move to a more moderate ground was I had a mother come in and say, can I talk to you? I thought, I don't think she even knew what my area of research was. She just knew I was trained in clinical psychology. But at first I thought she knew my research. Anyway, she was anguished because her daughter had started in therapy and now had cut her off and wouldn't communicate. And of course, she tried to contact the therapist, and of course, the therapist couldn't. And I really got it in my heart. It was like, so I explained to her why things were this way. And then we problem solved strategies she could try. But it really brought home to me that what is useful, perhaps in a therapeutic context, can really be incredibly hurtful and painful to this mother who, unlike Jennifer Fried's mom, was just in great pain and anguish over this daughter and concerned for this daughter and not boiling mad angry. So it is complicated, Jane, is the bottom line. All of this is complicated. Wish there was simple answers here. Yes, when I use that word dissociation, so people who have recovered memories, first of all, tend to be doing better. So we find if we take a sample of people who are in one study, for example, look at people who are in treatment for addictions, we had very low rates of recovered memory there because if you use a university sample, it's a highly functioning sample, get much higher rates of recovered memory. So it's the people who can cut stuff off are able to manage the pain better and function better, and they don't need to self-medicate with things like alcohol and drugs to bring the pain down. And then, and it seems there's a number, over the years, we've tried to understand who can do this and who can't do this. And the sort of extreme end of it is when you just park everything into a person and that you may not even know of and be aware of, but the sort of horrible memories sit there so that what you identify with as you can live a more pain-free life and a more productive life. That's a pretty extreme presentation. It's much more like when I'm a dentist, I hate that sound of the drill. You'd think after all these decades, they would have been able to fix that sound of the drill. And so I don't feel the need to hang out there and listen to the drills. I go to the beach, or I go walk in the forest. So I'm kind of dividing my experience of the person in the chair who's having the dental procedure and while I'm walking in. That's a milder, more adaptive form of that same kind of splitting. The other thing I thought you were going to say is I've been talking about what we call explicit memory, remembering events, remembering facts. That's the tip of the memory iceberg. The bigger part of memory is how I'm able to stand right now. My muscle memory, how I'm able to speak, how we're able to read, how you're able to understand language, my personality. All those ways, when you tie a shoe, if you remember, I kind of have a memory of, take it, put it over, bring it under. That's an explicit memory. What we call implicit memory is tying your shoe. You are remembering those lessons, but you're remembering without having the experience of remembering, which makes it more efficient. And we use memory every moment. If I stopped remembering how to stand, I'd collapse right now. I wouldn't be able to speak. You wouldn't understand me. We almost weren't able to, but we got this. And so trauma never gets forgotten implicitly. You may forget the story for a while. You remember at the level of the body. So that's where we're seeing all kinds of things, from poor physical health to depression and anxiety. And it's at the level of the body, you continue to remember, even if for a time you forget the story. Anyway, you've all been very patient, really appreciate you coming out on a Friday afternoon. Thank you.
And thank you again.